Lorelai didn't know the frail woman watching her from the high table was the Alpha King's mother. She didn't know that Queen Mother Kathleen Richmond had spent 9 years traveling between pacts and territories, following whispers that most dismissed as superstition, searching for someone with a gift that most people believed had died out generations ago. She didn't know that Alpha King Marmon Richmond was being slowly consumed from the inside by a dark spiritual corruption that no healer could name, no mage could trace, and no amount of power or wealth had been able to stop. She didn't know that every person Kathleen had trusted to save her son had failed. That 9 years of searching had led to dead ends, false hopes, and quiet grief. And she certainly didn't know that before this feast ended, 4 whispered words from a dying queen would reach across the crowded hall, pull her out of the invisible corner she had spent her entire life hiding in, and change everything. All Lorelai knew was that her back ached from 12 hours of kitchen work, that the bread roll she held in both hands was the first food she'd eaten since dawn, that the bench in the servants' corner was hard and cold and absolutely perfect because it was as far from Mistress Gundred Brock's sharp eyes as she could get without leaving the hall entirely. So she sat alone, and she ate, and she tried very hard not to look at the high table. The great hall of Valdenmoor blazed with the kind of light that only existed when someone very powerful wanted to remind everyone else exactly how powerful they were. 1,000 candles burned in iron chandeliers overhead, dripping wax onto the stone floor below in slow golden tears. The long tables running the length of the hall groaned under roasted boar, honeyed pheasant, towers of bread still steaming from the ovens, and enough wine to flood a small river. The air was thick with wood smoke, rich food, and the layered perfume of 200 nobles who had never spent a single day wondering where their next meal was coming from. Lorelai moved through all of it like a shadow. That was the skill she had spent 17 years perfecting. Don't be seen. Don't be noticed. Refill the cups before they empty so no one has a reason to call for you. Clear the plates before anyone has to ask. Become furniture. Become air. Become the kind of person a room full of important people looks straight through without registering. She was very good at it. She set her empty tray on a side table and slipped toward the servants' corner, the narrow bench pressed against the far wall near the kitchen entrance, where the hired help ate whatever was left over after the nobles had taken what they wanted. Tonight there was bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a small bowl of broth that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. Lorelai sat down and picked up the bread roll and decided it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. 12 more hours, she thought. Get through 12 more hours and Mistress Brock loads you back into the wagon and you go home. Home, the word was generous for what she actually had. A narrow room above the Brock estate kitchens, a straw mattress that had seen better decades, and a debt that grew faster than she could pay it down no matter how many extra hours she worked. But it was hers, small and cold and hers. She was 3 bites into the bread when he sat down beside her. Not literally, not physically, but she felt the weight of being watched settle over her like a second cloak, and she didn't need to look up to know the attention wasn't friendly. Lord Ralph Doolan lowered himself into the empty chair beside her corner bench with the casual ease of a man who had never in his life considered whether he was welcome somewhere. He was broad through the shoulders, well-dressed, with a politician's smile that had been carefully constructed to look warm. The kind of smile that probably worked on most people. "A pretty girl eating alone," he said. "That seems like a terrible waste." Lorelai felt it before she could stop it. The flicker behind her eyes. The pull of her gift activating without her permission, responding to the wrongness beneath his words the way a hand recoils from a hot surface before the brain even registers the danger. Golden threads drifted from his chest in her vision, the visible bonds connecting him to the people and things in his life. But his threads were knotted, tangled around something dark and deliberately hidden. The warmth in his smile did not match the cold calculation running beneath it like an underground river. She looked away immediately and took another bite of bread. "I prefer the quiet, my lord." "Nonsense. Someone like you shouldn't be sitting in corners." He leaned slightly closer. The wine on his breath was expensive. "Come find me after the feast. I'll make sure the rest of your evening is considerably more comfortable." The golden threads around him darkened as he spoke. She saw what the darkness carried. Other promises, other women, other corners very different from this one. "I'm needed back in the kitchens shortly," Lorelai said pleasantly, and stood and walked away before he could respond. She kept her pace steady and her expression neutral until she reached the far side of the hall. Then she pressed her back against the stone wall and breathed. "Close your eyes. Let it pass. You are not your mother. You are smarter than your mother. You survived by being smarter." Her mother, Valerie Finch, had possessed the same gift. Moonsight, she had called it in the private moments when it was just the two of them, and the night was quiet enough to tell the truth. The ability to see the threads of fate and bond, connecting every living soul, love and loyalty, and hatred and betrayal, all visible as light or shadow to anyone with the eyes to read them. For years, Valerie had used it with quiet care. Gentle nudges toward the lonely, soft warnings to the trusting, small acts of guidance that she never explained and never took credit for, until the night she made the mistake of telling the truth to someone powerful enough to destroy her for it. The elder's son had chosen a woman who was not his fated mate, and Valerie had told him so, and within a week the pack had run her out. Fraud, deceiver, witch. The words they used had been chosen carefully to be the most damaging kind. Valerie Finch died 2 years later, not from illness, from the quiet, systematic destruction of a woman stripped of every belonging she had loved. Lorelai had been 7 years old. She had watched all of it, and she had made herself a promise over her mother's grave that she had kept without breaking for 16 years. Never use it, never show it, never trust anyone with the truth of what you see. She was good at keeping promises. She picked up an empty tray from a side table and moved back into the hall, slipping between tables, refilling cups, collecting plates, becoming invisible again. She was halfway back to the servants' corner when the sensation crept across her skin. It came slowly, not threatening, not the way Lord Doolin's attention had felt predatory and calculating. This was something else entirely. Searching, deliberate. The feeling of being studied by someone who was looking for something specific and thought they might have found it. Lorelai had excellent instincts about being watched. You developed them quickly when your survival depended on going unnoticed. She risked one glance toward the high table. Alpha King Marmon Richmond sat at its center, and even from across the hall, he was the kind of person a room organized itself around without meaning to. Dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that was probably supposed to look effortless and succeeded. A jaw that belonged on something carved rather than born. Eyes the color of deep amber that moved across the crowd with the patient, unhurried watchfulness of someone who had learned a long time ago that danger rarely came loudly or obviously. He was barely touching his food. His goblet had sat at the same level for the last hour. He was scanning the hall with the careful attention of a man waiting for something, though he couldn't have said what. But it wasn't him watching her. It was the woman beside him. Lorelai recognized her from the tapestries that hung in the corridors of the Brock estate. Queen Mother Kathleen Richmond. The tapestries showed a woman who had once commanded rooms through sheer presence, silver-streaked hair, straight spine, eyes that saw everything and gave away nothing. The woman at the high table was a ghost of those tapestries. Paper-thin skin stretched over delicate bones, hands that trembled slightly around her untouched goblet, a face that had moved past the stage of fighting and arrived at the quieter, more dignified place of accepting. But her eyes had not accepted anything. They burned with a fierce, concentrated intelligence that was deeply at odds with the fragility surrounding them. And they were fixed completely, entirely, unmistakably on Lorelai. Look away, finish the bread. You are nobody. You are air. You are the girl in the corner, and that is all you are and all you want to be. Kathleen's hand rose from the table. One skeletal finger curled. A summons, unmistakable. No, absolutely not. A servant did not refuse a royal summons. The sentence for refusing a royal summons was not a formal punishment listed in any law. It was simply the end of everything, swift and quiet and permanent. Lorelai set down her tray. Her fingers had gone completely numb. She walked toward the high table. The noise of the feast didn't actually dim as she crossed the hall. She just stopped hearing it. Everything narrowed down to the distance between herself and the raised platform where the royal family sat, and the burning eyes tracking every step she took to close that distance. She stopped at the base of the 3 steps and curtsied low. "You summon me, Your Grace." "Come closer, child." Kathleen's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the feast noise like a blade through silk. "These old eyes don't see as well as they used to." Lorelai climbed the steps and approached, stopping at what she hoped was a respectful but not alarming distance. This close, she could see details the tapestries had certainly never shown. The faint bluish tinge at the Queen Mother's lips. The way her breathing was careful and controlled in the way of someone who had learned not to take deep breaths because deep breaths hurt. "What is your name?" "Lorelai, Your Grace. Lorelai Finch. I serve in the household of Mistress Gundred Brock, hired for this evening's service." "Lorelai," Kathleen tasted the name slowly, as though it had flavor. "Do you know why I called you over?" "No, Your Grace." The Queen Mother smiled. It was a small, sharp thing, full of private knowledge. "You're being careful with that answer." She leaned forward, and her next words were so quiet that Lorelai had to lean in to catch them. "I know about the threads, child. I know you can see them." The hall continued its noise around them. 200 nobles ate and drank and laughed and argued and noticed nothing. Lorelai's vision blurred at the edges. She knows. How does she know?" "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace." Kathleen's hand shot out faster than a dying woman should have been able to move, and gripped Lorelai's wrist with fingers that were surprisingly strong. "Don't waste what little time I have left with denials." Her burning eyes held Lorelai's without mercy. "I have been searching for someone with your gift for 9 years. 9 years of following whispers and rumors, and the stories that packs tell in the dark when they think nobody important is listening." Lorelai's throat had closed entirely. She couldn't have spoken if she'd tried. "My son is being destroyed," Kathleen whispered, and in those 4 words was the entire weight of a mother who had watched it happen and been unable to stop it. "Something dark was placed on him. It feeds on him a little more with each passing month. Every healer I've brought to him has failed. Every mage, every sage." Her grip tightened. "But you can see what they cannot. You can find what they cannot find." Lorelai's gaze moved to Marmon before she could stop it. And she saw it. She had been carefully, deliberately, not looking at him all evening. Not since she'd noticed him at the high table and felt the first dangerous pull of her moon sight responding to something it recognized. But now she looked, and she saw everything. Golden threads surrounded the Alpha King like a web of light, his bonds to the warriors flanking him, to his mother beside him, to every member of his pack in the hall. All of them true, all of them real, all of them exactly what they appeared to be. Except one. Among the golden threads, one ran dark. Deliberately, carefully, purposefully dark. It coiled around his chest like a slow-tightening chain, feeding on him with every breath he drew. It had been there for years. She could see the depth of its roots, how far it had worked itself into him. And then she saw something else. Something that made her snap her gaze away so fast, she nearly lost her balance. A golden thread running from his chest to hers. Blazing, enormous, unmistakable. "Find the one who did this to him," Kathleen whispered. "You are the only one who can." Lorelai looked back at the Queen Mother. At the burning, desperate, fatting eyes of a woman who had spent 9 years chasing a legend, because the alternative was watching her son die. She thought of her mother, of what it had cost Valerie Finch to use her gift honestly in a world that didn't want honest things. And then she thought of the dark thread coiled around Marmon's heart like a chain. "How long does he have?" she asked quietly. Kathleen's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "Less than I have," she said. The servant's wagon left Valdenmoor at midnight, without Lorelai in it. She stood in the courtyard and watched it go, Mistress Gundred Brock's rigid back visible through the rear opening as the wagon rolled through the gates. Gundred had not been pleased. Gundred had, in fact, been the precise opposite of pleased in a way that Lorelai suspected would have lasting consequences she'd deal with eventually. But a Queen Mother's request outranked a household overseer's objections, even when the household overseer delivered those objections in the particular low, controlled tone she reserved for maximum damage. You think this makes you something, Gundred had said, her voice quiet in the way that meant it was most dangerous. It doesn't. Girls like you don't become something. They disappear. Lorelei had nodded and kept her expression empty and said nothing, which was the only safe response to Gundred Brock in that particular mood. Now she stood in the emptying courtyard while stable hands led horses away, and the last of the hired servants filed through the gate, and she tried to process what the last 2 hours of her life had actually contained. A palace attendant appeared at her elbow. "If you'll follow me, Miss Finch, the Queen Mother is ready for you." Kathleen's private sitting room was nothing like the Great Hall. It was small and warm, lit by a low fire and a cluster of candles on the table. The Queen Mother sat in a high-backed chair wrapped in blankets despite the fire's warmth, a cup of something steaming at her elbow that she wasn't drinking. Marmon stood at the window. He turned when Lorelei entered, and she felt the pull of the golden thread between them like a physical tug against her ribs. She kept her moon sight carefully, deliberately closed, and fixed her attention on Kathleen. "Sit down, child." Kathleen gestured to the chair across from her. "We have a great deal to discuss, and I tire easily these days." Lorelei sat. The attendant who had led her here disappeared through a side door. The room contained only the three of them. "You already know about the corruption," Kathleen began. "You saw it at the feast." "Yes, Your Grace." "Then I won't waste time explaining what it is. What I need you to understand is what it means." The Queen Mother's hands wrapped around the untouched cup without lifting it. "My son has been weakening for 3 years. Slowly, precisely, in the way of something that wants to consume rather than kill outright. 3 years ago, he was the strongest alpha in 6 territories. He still appears strong to anyone without your eyes, but I have watched him, and I know what I am seeing." Someone placed it deliberately. Lorelei kept her voice even. "It didn't happen by accident. The roots are too deep, too structured. Someone with knowledge built that corruption intentionally." Marmon made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She didn't look at him. "Yes," Kathleen said, "and that someone has access to him, regular access. The corruption requires proximity to feed. It was placed by someone close to him, someone he trusts, someone who has spent 3 years maintaining it while smiling at him across tables like the one we sat at tonight." The fire crackled. Outside the window, the last of the feast guests were departing, voices fading into the night. "Every healer I've brought to him finds nothing," Kathleen continued. "Because they look with ordinary eyes. The corruption doesn't exist in his body. It exists in his bonds, in the threads your mother would have called the fabric of a person's soul." Her eyes fixed on Lorelei. "Your gift is the only one that can see it clearly enough to find its source." "I need to see everyone connected to him," Lorelei said slowly, thinking through it. "Everyone with regular access. I need to look at their threads." "That's precisely what I'm asking you to do." "And if I find the source," she finally looked at Marmon, "can it be removed?" He held her gaze steadily. He had his mother's directness, she thought, the same quality of looking at something straight rather than sideways. "That's the question we can't answer yet." "I need to be honest with you," Lorelei said. "I've spent my entire life hiding this gift. I've never tried to do anything with it except see. I don't know what I'm capable of beyond seeing." "You're more capable than you know," Kathleen said, with the certainty of someone stating a fact they have spent 9 years verifying. "That's true of most things worth having." The fire shifted. The candles flickered. "There's something else," Lorelei said carefully. She needed to say this now before she lost the nerve. "At the feast, when I looked at him," she chose each word with the precision of someone diffusing something, "I saw something other than the corruption." Kathleen went very still. Marmon's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened in a way she could feel without looking directly at him. "A thread," Lorelei said, "between us, golden, the kind that doesn't appear between strangers." The silence that followed was the kind that had already known what it was going to contain. "I know," Kathleen said quietly. "You knew." The steadiness Lorelei had been maintaining developed a small crack. "I suspected. That's partly why I was searching for someone with your specific gift." Kathleen set down the cup she still hadn't drunk from. "The old texts speak of it, the Luna bond, A fated pairing where one half carries Moon's sight and one half carries the Alpha mark. Two halves of the same purpose. I thought if I found someone with the sight, I would also find. My son's fated mate, Marmon said. His voice was quiet, measured, something carefully restrained moving beneath the surface of it. Lorraine pressed her hands flat on her knees to stop them from trembling. That's not something I can think about right now. I'm not asking you to think about it, Kathleen said gently. I'm asking you to help him. Whatever else exists between you, that's a conversation for later. Right now, there is a man being slowly consumed by something dark and deliberate, and you are the only person in the world who can find what is causing it. Lorraine looked at Marmon. He was watching her with those amber eyes that didn't flinch or deflect. She thought about her mother, about the truth she had carried quietly for 30 years before one honest word destroyed everything. She thought about the dark thread coiled around this man's heart. I'll need access to the council chambers, she said, and to every gathering where your advisors are present. I'll need a reason to be there that doesn't raise questions. Kathleen almost smiled. I'll tell them you're my personal attendant. Old women are allowed their eccentricities. Lorraine nodded once. Then I'll start in the morning. She stood to leave. At the door, Marmon's voice stopped her. Lorraine. She turned. He was still standing at the window, the night dark behind him. Thank you, he said, just that, quietly, like he meant it as something specific and personal rather than a formality. She nodded and left before the golden thread between them could pull any harder. In the small room, the palace attendant showed her to a real room, with a real mattress and a fire already burning in the grate. Lorraine sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands over her eyes. He is your fated mate. The thought had the quality of something that had been true for a very long time and had simply been waiting for permission to exist. You cannot want this, she told herself firmly. You cannot want any of this. She lay down fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the palace settle into nighttime quiet around her. She didn't sleep for a long time. Morning arrived with pale light through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of a palace waking to its daily routines. Lorraine dressed quickly and did a careful inventory of everything she owned that she'd brought with her, which wasn't much. A change of clothes. The small knife her mother had given her that she'd kept for 16 years. A piece of ribbon worn soft with age. She had traveled light her whole life. It made leaving easier. You're going to leave when this is done, she reminded herself, tying the ribbon around her wrist where she'd worn it since she was 7 years old. You help him. You take whatever payment Kathleen offers, and you leave and build something that isn't built on someone else's need for your gift. She believed this with the determined commitment of someone who suspected they were lying to themselves. The palace at morning was a different creature than the palace at feast night. The candlelight grandeur was replaced by practical daylight that showed dust on the tapestries and worn patches on the carpets and servants moving through corridors with the efficient purposefulness of a household that had a great deal to accomplish before the nobility required attention. Lorraine fell into step among them without difficulty. 17 years of domestic service had given her an instinctive understanding of how staff moved through a house, the rhythms and routines, the spaces that belonged to different people at different hours, the art of being present without being visible. A young maid named Pearl Haskins found her in the East Corridor and delivered a message from the Queen Mother with the careful formality of someone who had been told to be discreet. Lorraine was expected at Kathleen's chambers for the morning briefing. Her role as personal attendant was already being communicated to the household staff. She spent an hour with Kathleen, receiving a detailed account of the council structure, the household hierarchy, and every person with regular access to Marmon. Kathleen was thorough and precise, and clearly hadn't spent the last 9 years searching without also spending them learning everything there was to know about everyone who surrounded her son. The list was not short. 7 council members, 12 senior household staff, 4 personal guards, a rotating roster of visiting nobles and pack representatives. The corruption is consistent, Lorraine said, studying the list. It doesn't spike or diminish, it maintains a steady pressure, which means the person feeding it has regular, reliable access. not occasional. Someone in this household, Kathleen agreed. I'll start with the council. Kathleen's morning gathering of senior advisors took place in a room adjoining the main council chamber, an informal meeting of the kind that didn't appear on official schedules, but where most of the actual decisions were made. Lorelei attended as Kathleen's attendant, standing slightly behind the Queen Mother's chair, doing what good attendants did, being present and invisible simultaneously. She opened her moon sight carefully and began to map. Lord Harlan Bonner, clean threads, genuinely loyal to the crown, a slight shadow around his bond to his wife that suggested marital difficulty but nothing political. Lord Emmett McGraw, complicated threads, sharp ambition running beneath his words, but the ambition was the ordinary kind that wanted advancement through legitimate means. Lady Clara Voss, the only woman on the council, with threads that were precise and controlled and completely honest. Lorelei liked her immediately. Lord Clyde Turlow, threads that showed deep fear beneath a composed surface. But fear of what? She filed that away to examine later. And then Lord Wyatt Haskins. She had been leaving him for last, not because she suspected him, because she suspected herself of wanting to find what she was looking for and not trusting that she wouldn't see it somewhere it didn't actually exist. She let her gaze rest on him and opened her moon sight fully, and went very still. His threads were unlike anything else in the room, carefully constructed, deliberately arranged. The golden threads of loyalty and alliance that should have run from him to the crown and to his fellow council members were there, but they were fabricated. She could see the structure beneath them, the deliberate way they'd been built to look like something genuine. Beneath the golden surface, the actual threads were dark and self-directed. Every bond Lord Wyatt Haskins showed the world was a performance. And from his chest, barely visible, running beneath the floorboards of the room like a hidden channel of dark water, a thread reaching toward Marmon. Dark, purposeful, feeding. Lorelei kept her expression completely blank and looked away, and spent the remaining 20 minutes of the meeting studying the pattern on the floor. She had found him. On their third day in the palace, Marmon found her in the library. She had gone there in the late afternoon, genuinely searching for records Kathleen had requested regarding old territorial agreements. She wasn't expecting company. The library was one of those palace spaces that existed in a permanent late afternoon, quiet regardless of the actual hour, all dark wood and leather, and the particular silence of a great many books in a confined space. She was reaching for a document on a high shelf when she heard the door open. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The golden thread between them pulled taut the moment he crossed the threshold, a sensation she was becoming reluctantly accustomed to and absolutely refused to find comforting. You were at the feast, he said, in the servants' corner. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, studying her with that same patient attention he'd applied to the feast crowd. Yes, Your Majesty. You were eating alone. There was bread, she said. It was excellent bread. Something moved briefly in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. My mother says you've agreed to help. I have. She didn't tell me much about how. He leaned against the nearest bookcase with an informality that sat oddly on the formal surroundings. I'd like to understand what you're actually doing. Lorelei considered him for a moment. He had the quality of someone who asked direct questions and expected direct answers, which she respected even when it was inconvenient. I see connections, she said carefully, between people, the threads of loyalty and love and hatred and deception. They're visible to me the way color is visible to other people. When I look at someone, I can see what their bonds actually are rather than what they're presenting. And when you look at me, the golden thread blazed with such force that she took a small, involuntary step backward. I see the corruption, she said, which was true and also the minimum acceptable answer. His amber eyes held her steadily, and she had underestimated how direct he was going to be. And other things, she said, in a tone that she hoped communicated clearly that she wasn't going to elaborate. He let it rest, which was both a relief and somehow more unsettling than if he'd pressed. Have you found anything? He asked. I'm still looking. Which was not technically a lie. She had found the source. She hadn't yet found enough to bring to him, not evidence that would stand against a council member's denial, not the kind of proof that would survive the inevitable counterattack. "Tell me when you do," he said. He straightened and moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I believe what my mother told me about your gift. I don't think you're inventing things or seeing what you want to see." A pause. "I imagine a great many people have accused you of that over the years." Lori didn't answer, but something in her chest shifted anyway. After he left, she stood alone in the library and pressed one hand briefly against the wall to steady herself. "You cannot want this," she told herself, for what was becoming a regular refrain. "You are here to help him and then leave. That is the only thing you are here for." The library was quiet and patient, and did not point out the obvious. By the end of the first week, Lori had developed a precise, detailed map of everyone connected to Marmon and what their bonds actually contained. It was extraordinary, if she was honest, to use her gift openly rather than in stolen glances and carefully contained moments. She had spent so long looking at threads peripherally, catching the minimum information needed to stay safe and no more, that allowing herself to actually look, fully, attentively, with the patient thoroughness her mother had tried to teach her, felt like using a muscle that had been deliberately kept still for years. What she found in the palace was largely what she would have found anywhere people gathered with competing interests. Ambition wearing the clothing of loyalty. Affection complicated by politics. Genuine devotion living uncomfortably beside self-interest. The ordinary complicated texture of human bonds in concentrated form. And Wyatt Haskins, moving through all of it with perfectly fabricated threads, and a corruption that reached toward Marmon like a root reaching toward water. She needed more than what she could see. She needed evidence that existed outside her own perception, something that could be held, examined, verified by people who couldn't see threads. She began, carefully, to look for it. Kathleen's condition was another thing she tracked. She had noticed on their second day that the Queen Mother's visible decline tracked against the depth of the corruption on Marmon, as though the mother-son bond was drawing from Kathleen's own life force to try to compensate for what the corruption was taking. Breaking the corruption wouldn't just save Marmon. She mentioned this to Kathleen during a quiet afternoon, and watched something move through the old woman's eyes that looked a great deal like relief. "Then there's another reason to hurry," was all Kathleen said. The proximity to Marmon was becoming its own kind of difficulty. He had developed a habit of appearing in whatever room she was working in, not obviously, not in a way that could be called deliberate, always with a legitimate reason. Documents to retrieve, reports to review, a conversation with a council member who happened to be meeting in that particular corridor. He would acknowledge her with the easy courtesy he applied to everyone in his household, which was not what created the problem. The problem was the golden thread, which had its own opinion about proximity and expressed that opinion loudly and without her consent. You were made for each other, the thread communicated in the wordless language of fated bonds. Stop pretending otherwise. Stop running. Stop. She got very good at pretending she couldn't feel it. On the 8th evening, she was in the small garden off the east corridor, sitting on a low wall in the cold because the cold was clarifying and her head needed clarifying after a day of intense moon sight work. She heard footsteps and prepared to stand and be somewhere else. "Stay," Marmon said. "I'm not going to make you stand on ceremony in an empty garden." He sat on the wall beside her with the kind of unself-consciousness that suggested he had never had to learn how to be at ease in his own spaces. A comfortable silence settled between them before he broke it. "My mother likes you," he said. "Your mother likes what she thinks I can do for you." "That's not what she says." Lori looked at him sideways. "What does she say?" "She says you remind her of herself at your age, which from her is a significant compliment." He looked out at the garden, where the last of the season's flowers were holding on with stubborn cold weather persistence. "She doesn't say that about many people." "How is she, honestly?" A pause. Better than she was 3 months ago. Something about being here, having something to act on instead of just wait for "I think it's helping." He turned to look at her. "You're helping." Lori looked back at the garden and tried to think of something neutral to say. and instead of finding anything neutral, she found herself laughing. Suddenly, unexpectedly, at nothing in particular except the accumulated absurdity of the last week, and the garden in the cold and the king beside her saying kind things when she was trying very hard to stay at a sensible distance. It was a real laugh, not the careful, polite approximation she used in social situations. The actual version, which she hadn't heard from herself in some time. Marmon went completely still. She felt it the moment she heard herself, pressed a hand over her mouth, pulled the laugh back in, reassembled her composure. "I'm sorry, that was." "Don't apologize for that," he said quietly. The amber eyes were on her face with an expression she didn't examine closely because examining it closely would have been dangerous. "You should do that more." The golden thread blazed so intensely, she pressed her other hand to her chest before she could stop herself. He saw the gesture. His eyes tracked to her hand against her chest, then back to her face, and something moved in his expression. Recognition without vocabulary, the sensation of knowing something without yet having the words for it. The moment ended when a guard appeared at the garden entrance. "Your Majesty, the evening report." Marmon stood. Lorry looked at the flowers. "Good night, Lorry," he said. "Good night, Your Majesty." She sat in the cold garden for another 20 minutes after he left, pressing her hand to her chest and telling herself she was doing it because the night air was cold. She wasn't doing it because the night air was cold. On the 9th day, Wyatt Haskins found her alone. The message came through Pearl, delivered with the careful neutrality of someone who didn't know what it contained. Lord Wyatt Haskins requested a brief private meeting with Kathleen's personal attendant regarding some documentation the Queen Mother had requested. A council matter. Routine. Lorry had read the message 3 times, felt the wrongness of it settle into her bones, and gone anyway. Because Wyatt was beginning to move, which meant she had less time than she'd thought, which meant she needed to know what he knew and what he intended to do about it. Sometimes the only way to find out what a predator was planning was to let it think it had cornered you. She was very clear-eyed about the risk. She went anyway. The room was a small meeting chamber off the east corridor, used for minor administrative conversations. Wyatt was already there when she arrived, standing with his back to the window in a position that someone less experienced at reading people might have thought was casual. He had dropped the performance. Not entirely, the politician's surface was still in place, the constructed warmth still present in his expression. But something beneath it was visible that hadn't been before, and that visible thing was assessing her with cold, professional precision. "Miss Finch," he said pleasantly, "thank you for coming." She curtsied and said nothing. "The Queen Mother has taken quite an interest in you." His tone was conversational, friendly, the tone of someone making small talk, an unusual position for a hired kitchen servant. "I'm grateful for her confidence," Lorry said evenly. "As you should be." He moved slightly, repositioning himself with the easy movement of someone who was accustomed to owning any room he stood in. "I'm curious what particular skills make you so valuable to her." Lorry kept her expression pleasantly blank. "I'm attentive and reliable." "I'm sure you are." He looked at her directly. "I've been watching you this week, Miss Finch. You pay a great deal of attention to people, very focused attention. The kind that isn't really about the documents you're supposed to be organizing." The room felt smaller than it had when she entered it. "I'm thorough," she said. "You're something." The pleasant surface thinned slightly. "Your mother was Valerie Finch, the woman run out of the Morrow Pack 16 years ago for claiming she could see things other people couldn't." Everything in Lorry went very quiet. "I've done my research," Wyatt continued. "The gift runs in bloodlines according to the old texts, mother to daughter primarily." He tilted his head. "I'd hate to see history repeat itself." The threat was perfectly constructed. No accusation, no specific claim, just the shape of what could happen held up gently for her to look at. "I understand your concern, my lord," Lorry said, in a voice she was very proud of for how steady it was. "But I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. My mother was a healer. She had some unconventional methods, but—" "We don't need to play this game," Wyatt said, dropping all pretense of friendliness. "I know what you are. I know what the Queen Mother brought you here to do, and I am telling you very clearly and with genuine goodwill toward your continued well-being that you should stop doing it." "Doing what, my lord?" "Looking." The word landed hard. "Whatever you think you've seen, unsee it. Whatever the Queen Mother has told you, forget it. Accept whatever she's offered you and spend the remainder of your time here being a good attendant, and then go back to wherever you came from and live a quiet, safe, long life." The silence that followed was very complete. "Thank you for the advice," Lorre said. "Is there anything else, my lord?" The door opened behind her. "Is everything all right?" Marmon's voice. She felt the golden thread snap taut so sharply it nearly pulled her off balance. She turned. He stood in the doorway, his amber eyes moving between her and Wyatt with the unhurried attention of someone assembling a picture from its components. Wyatt's performance rebuilt itself with impressive speed. "Your Majesty, I was just discussing some documentation with your mother's new attendant. A small misunderstanding, I believe." He smiled. "All resolved." "Lorre." She met his eyes and kept her face neutral and nodded once. "Resolved, Your Majesty." Marmon looked at Wyatt for a moment that lasted slightly longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you, Harlan. I believe the afternoon council has begun." Wyatt left. As he passed Lorre, she felt his thread brush against the corruption on Marmon, a deliberate, feeding contact, brief and practiced, and invisible to everyone in the room except her. She kept her composure until she heard his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then her knees decided they had carried her far enough for one day and began to give way. Marmon crossed the room in 3 steps and caught her, his hands on her arms, steadying her before she reached the floor. The golden thread erupted at the contact, blazing through her entire system, enormous and relentless, filling her vision with gold. She saw his threads clearly for the first time at close range. True bonds to his warriors, his pack, his mother. A genuine desire to protect and serve the people who depended on him. And the dark chain wound through all of it, coiling tighter than she'd seen it before. Wyatt's deliberate feeding moments ago had strengthened it. And the golden thread from his chest to hers, blazing so bright she could barely see anything else. She looked up at him. He was looking down at her with something in his face that was no longer just watchfulness, something that had arrived recently and wasn't going to leave. "What did he actually say to you?" Marmon asked quietly. "He told me to stop looking." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "He knows what I can do. He was threatening me." Marmon's expression didn't change visibly, but something in the quality of his stillness shifted. "He knows you're searching for the corruption." "Yes." "Which means he knows about the corruption." "Yes." A long pause. "Do you know who it is?" She had been careful with this information for 9 days, waiting for enough evidence to be undeniable. But Wyatt had just shown her that she had run out of time for careful. "Yes," she said, "it's him." The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges itself into something new and permanent. "Tell me everything," Marmon said. So she did, standing in the small meeting room with his hands still on her arms and the golden thread blazing between them. She told him about Moon's sight and what it showed her, and everything she had mapped over 9 days of careful observation. She told him about Wyatt's fabricated bonds and the dark thread running from him to the corruption on Marmon's heart. She told him about her mother, because it was necessary context, because he needed to understand what this gift had cost people who carried it. He listened without interrupting, without doubt, without the careful skeptical assessment that most people applied to claims they couldn't verify for themselves. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "I believe you," he said, simply, completely. Those 3 words broke something in Lorre that had been braced against breaking for 16 years. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together and looked at the middle distance for a moment and breathed very carefully until the feeling passed. "We need to bring this to the council," she said when she trusted her voice again. "But carefully, he'll deny it. The bonds I can see, I can't show them to anyone else. I need evidence from outside my own perception." "We'll get it," Marmon said. "Together." Together, the word sat between them and didn't leave.
The evidence came through Lord Emmett McGraw, who had been carrying something that looked like guilt and had the particular quality of someone waiting for permission to put a burden down. Lorei had noticed it in his threads during the first week and filed it away. Now she went to him directly, with Marmon's knowledge, and asked him plainly what he was carrying. Emmett had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who had been hoping someone would ask that specific question. What he gave them was a collection of documents he had been holding for 8 months, unable to bring them forward without someone to bring them to. Financial records, private correspondence, a letter from Wyatt to a territorial lord outside the kingdom that contained, in coded but decipherable language, an explicit arrangement for the steady weakening of Valdenmoor's king in exchange for favorable territorial agreements once Wyatt held power. Combined with the testimony of Lady Clara Voss, who had witnessed a private meeting between Wyatt and a woman known to practice dark spiritual arts 3 years ago, and had been dismissed when she raised concerns. The evidence was substantial. It was enough. The emergency council session was called on the 11th morning. Lorei dressed with the care of someone preparing for something they might not survive. Not physically. Marmon had positioned guards she trusted throughout the corridor and the chamber. But the other kind of survival. The kind her mother had failed at standing before a pack with the truth. Pearl found her in the corridor. "You don't look scared," Pearl said. I'm very scared," Lorei said honestly. Pearl squeezed her hand briefly and said nothing else, which was exactly the right response. The council chamber was full. 7 council members at the long table. Senior household staff along the walls. 4 of Marmon's personal guard positioned at the doors. Kathleen, who had insisted on attending despite the physician's objections, seated to Marmon's right with the particular stillness of someone expending every available unit of energy on being present. Wyatt Haskins sat in his usual seat, perfectly composed. Emmett presented the documents first. The financial records, the correspondence, the territorial arrangement letter. He presented them with the careful precision of a man who had been planning this moment for 8 months and was going to do it correctly. Wyatt listened with the patient expression of someone who had prepared for this. "Forgeries," he said when Emmett finished. "Skillfully done, but forgeries nonetheless. I can have 5 witnesses to my whereabouts on every date referenced in those documents." Lady Clara spoke next. Her voice was steady and clear, and she looked at Wyatt without flinching while she described what she had witnessed 3 years ago. "The testimony of one woman," Wyatt said pleasantly, "who has had a personal grievance against me since I was named senior council advisor over her 3 years ago." The council shifted. Lorei could see it, the doubt moving through them, the familiar pattern of a well-prepared defense doing its work. Marmon looked at her, the same small nod he had given her in the library. Lorei stood. She had prepared words. Careful, organized, unstructured words that she had assembled over the previous 2 days. She had planned to present her gift methodically, acknowledge the skepticism it would provoke, build her case logically. She looked at the council members around the table and abandoned all of it. She opened her moon sight fully. Wider than she had ever opened it in her life. Wider than she had ever permitted herself to, even in private. And she spoke from what she actually saw. She described Emmett's threads, the guilt and the genuine loyalty and the 8 months of carrying something he desperately needed to put down. She described Clara's threads, clean and precise and honest in every direction. She described Harlan Bonner's threads, and Lord Clyde Turlow's threads, and every person at the table, with the specific detail of someone reading text that only she could see. The room went profoundly quiet. Then she described Wyatt's. She described the fabricated bonds, the performance of loyalty constructed over years of careful work, the dark thread running from his chest toward Marmon like a root toward water. She described what it was doing to the king, the slow consumption, the deliberate maintenance, The feeding moments she had witnessed, including the one in the corridor outside this very room 2 days ago. "You're asking this council to accept the word of a kitchen servant with an inherited delusion," Wyatt said, and his voice had lost none of its smoothness. "I'm not asking this council to accept anything on faith," Lorelai said. "I'm showing you what exists. All of you can feel it, and if you're willing to look." She reached for something she hadn't known she could do until this moment. She didn't plan it. It arrived fully formed, the way that things arrive when they've been true for a long time and finally have the conditions they need to manifest. She reached through her moonsight and showed them. Not the same way she saw. She couldn't give others her exact perception. But she pushed the truth of what she saw outward, and every person in the room felt something shift. A sudden clarity, a sudden ability to sense the weight of the bonds around them, the real ones and the constructed ones, present to them in a way they had never been before. Several council members looked suddenly uncomfortable. One pressed a hand to his chest. Wyatt felt it too. She turned the full force of her moonsight on him and showed him his own threads. The fabricated ones and the true ones. The dark channel running from him to the king. The years of patient, deliberate destruction. Every person he had maneuvered or sacrificed or removed. Every bond he had corrupted in service of a plan that had taken him a decade to build. She showed him all of it, the complete, exact, unsparing truth of what he had done. Wyatt Haskins crumpled. Not suddenly. The collapse was slow, like a carefully constructed building settling into itself, the surface holding while everything beneath it gave way. He gripped the table edge, his composure dissolving layer by layer until what remained was a man sitting with the full weight of his own truth, which was heavier than it had looked from the outside. He stopped. He stopped again. There was nothing to say. The truth didn't leave room for anything else. "Take him," Marmon said quietly. The guards moved. Wyatt was led from the chamber without resistance. Then Lorelai turned to Marmon. The dark corruption was still there. Wyatt's arrest didn't automatically end what he'd built over 3 years. She could see it clearly now, in the silence left by what had just happened. And she could see that it was weakening without its source feeding it, but it hadn't broken. She crossed to him and did the thing she had been refusing to do for 11 days. She reached for the golden thread between them and held it consciously. Fully. Without pretending it wasn't there. The mate bond blazed to life. And the power in it was not something she had any frame of reference for. She had seen mate bonds her whole life, golden threads of fated connection, bright and strong. She had never experienced one from the inside. She pushed all of it toward the dark corruption on Marmon's heart. The full force of what the mate bond carried. Not just hers, but his. Activated now, responding to hers. The two halves finding each other, and combining into something that was considerably greater than either alone. The corruption didn't stand a chance. It broke apart the way ice breaks in spring, suddenly, completely, leaving behind the clean, unburdened thing it had been covering. Marmon drew a breath. A real one, the kind that came without effort or shadow. From her chair at the head of the room, Kathleen Richmond drew a breath exactly like it. The room was very quiet. Lorelai let go of the thread, and her knees were suggesting strongly that she sit down. She did not sit down. "Well," said Lady Clara Voss from somewhere behind her, "I think that answers the question of the documentation's authenticity." 3 weeks later, the palace was preparing for a celebration. Wyatt Haskins's trial had proceeded with the swift efficiency of a case where the evidence was overwhelming, and the defendant had broken publicly in front of the entire senior council. The territorial lord he'd been corresponding with had been contacted. The woman who had placed the original corruption had been found and dealt with. The full scope of a plan 10 years in the making had been systematically dismantled. The kingdom was beginning to understand what had been happening to its king. And the kingdom, by and large, I was taking this information in the particular way of people who had been watching someone they trusted grow gradually weaker and had been quietly frightened about it. The relief, when it became clear that the corruption was broken and Marmon was recovering, had a collective quality. The feeling of a breath held for 3 years finally released. Kathleen Richmond was also recovering. Visibly, daily, in ways that made her physician look startled every morning when he came to take her readings. Lorai had packed her bag. She packed it carefully, on the morning of the 22nd day, in the room that had been hers for 3 weeks. She folded the 2 changes of clothes she'd rotated between. She wound her mother's ribbon around her wrist. She placed the small knife in her pocket. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the packed bag. She had fulfilled her obligation. She had found the source of the corruption. She had broken it. She had provided evidence that had convicted a man who had nearly destroyed the kingdom. She had been offered payment, more than enough to leave Gundred Brock's household forever, to build something that actually belonged to her. She was leaving. She was absolutely, completely, definitively leaving. She picked up the bag. "Where are you going?" Marmon stood in the doorway. He was dressed simply. No formal council wear. None of the visible architecture of the Alpha King. Just a dark shirt and the amber eyes that looked at her with the same patient directness they had always used. He looked at the bag. "I did what I came here to do," she said. "You're free of it. Your mother is recovering. There's no reason for me to stay." "You know there is." She looked at the window. Outside, the palace grounds were bright with late autumn light, preparations for the celebration visible on the lawns below. "Marmon, tell me what you see," he said. "Right now. What do you see between us?" She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she opened her moon sight with them, because there was no more point in pretending. The golden thread between them blazed the way it always blazed. Permanent. Patient. Enormous. "I see your fated mate bond," she said. "I felt it," he said quietly. "When you held on to it in the council chamber. I didn't know what it was before that. I knew something was there. Something that pulled whenever you were near. But in that moment, I felt exactly what it was." He crossed the room slowly. "I asked my mother afterward what a fated Luna bond felt like. She said I'd know it when I felt it." "What did she say when you told her you'd felt it?" "She said she'd been waiting for me to figure it out." The corner of his mouth moved. She also said that in her experience, the person on the other end of the bond tends to spend considerably longer in denial than the Alpha does, and I should be patient. Despite everything, despite the packed bag in her hands and the careful distance she was trying to maintain, Lorai felt laughter arrive again, the real version, surprised and helpless. Marmon went still the way he always went still when she laughed. Like it was something he was trying to memorize so he'd be able to find it again. "Stay," he said. The word was simple and complete, and carried none of the elaborate political framing she might have expected from a king making a request. "Not because my mother searched 9 years for you. Not because the kingdom owes you more than it can currently calculate. Stay because that thread between us is real, and you know it is, and you're tired of running from real things." Lorai set the bag down. "My mother had this gift," she said quietly. "She used it honestly. Once. And it destroyed her." "I know." He didn't reach for her, didn't move toward her. Just stood at the distance she'd set and let her have it. "I know what it cost her, and I know what hiding it has cost you. I'm asking you to believe that this is different, that I am different." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to let what you can see with your own gift tell you whether that's true." She looked at him. She opened her moon sight as fully as she had in the council chamber, and she looked at him without any of the careful peripheral management she'd been applying for 3 weeks. His threads were everything she'd seen them to be that first night. True bonds to his pack, his warriors, his mother. The genuine, uncomplicated desire to protect and serve the people who depended on him. No fabrication, no hidden channels, no architecture beneath the surface. And the golden thread from his chest to hers, blazing with the patient intensity of something that had been waiting a very long time for her to stop looking away. She set down the bag. "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in his expression that was entirely different from anything she'd seen on it before. Warm and alive and quietly delighted. "Tell me." "I use my gift openly. No hiding it. No apologizing for it. If I see something, I say so." "Agreed. The girl who works in your kitchens, Pearl Haskins, she should be promoted. She has the kind of loyalty that deserves to be used better than kitchen work." "Done. And I want a letter sent to the Morrow Pack, formally, stating that Valerie Finch was not a fraud." Her voice held on this with only minor effort. She deserves to have that on record, even now. Marmon was quiet for a moment. "I'll write it myself," he said. Lorrai nodded once. Then she looked at the bag on the floor and looked at him and let the thread between them pull in the direction it had been pulling since the night she had eaten bread alone in the servants' corner and tried very hard not to look at the high table. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." He crossed the remaining distance and cupped her face in both hands with the gentleness of someone who understood exactly what they were holding, and he kissed her with all the patience of a man who had waited long enough and intended to do this properly. The golden thread blazed so brightly she could see it even with her eyes closed. The mating ceremony was held 3 weeks later, under the full moon in the castle gardens where the last of the year's frost-resistant roses were still blooming. Lorrai wore deep gold silk, the exact color of the thread she had spent 3 weeks trying to look away from. Her mother's ribbon was woven into her braided hair, old and worn and more valuable to her than anything else she owned. Pearl Haskins walked beside her to the garden entrance, her new position as household steward already sitting on her shoulders with quiet pride. Marmon waited at the altar in formal black, his amber eyes finding her before she had crossed half the distance, holding her gaze all the way to the front. Kathleen Richmond stood as witness, fully upright, fully present, looking like someone who had won a 9-year argument and was allowing herself to feel satisfied about it. Lord Emmett McGraw performed the ceremony with the careful dignity of someone who understood the weight of what he was witnessing, and the vows were not traditional. Lorrai and Marmon had written them together, sitting in the library 3 evenings before, arguing about wording until they were both laughing too much to argue effectively. "I vow to see you truly," Lorrai said, her voice carrying through the garden with the steadiness of someone who had spent 16 years being silent and was done with silence. "Not just your strength, but the weight you carry. Not just your crown, but your heart. I vow to use what I can see in service of this pack, and in service of you, and to never again apologize for the truth of what my eyes show me." "I vow to be worthy of your sight," Marmon said. His voice was rough with something that he didn't try to smooth away. "To govern with the honesty you deserve to see from me. To protect your gift not because it is useful, but because it is yours. And you are mine. And everything that belongs to you is something I will spend every day earning the right to stand beside." He paused. "I vow to never put bread rolls in the servants' corner that are anything less than excellent." A sound moved through the gathered crowd that was half laugh and half the specific warmth of people witnessing something real. Emmett pronounced them joined. Marmon kissed her under the full moon while the pack cheered, and Lorrai thought about the girl who had sat alone at the feast with aching feet and hollow hunger, and the desperate quiet hope that someday things might be different. She had gotten different. Just not the kind she'd been imagining. After the ceremony, after the celebration had settled into its late evening warmth, and the pack had eaten and danced and congratulated and gradually found their way to comfortable corners, Lorrai slipped away to the edge of the garden. She stood in the dark with her face tipped up and opened her moon sight fully, wide open, no management, no careful peripheral control. The great web of the pack's bonds spread out before her, every thread visible, golden, and complicated and alive. The bond between a young warrior and the girl he hadn't told yet. The deep old bond between two women who had been friends since childhood, and would be until they were old. The tangled, healing bond of a father and son in the early stages of finding their way back to each other. The steady, warm bond of every person in this pack to their king. Every thread precious. Every connection the living fabric of something real. "What do you see?" Marmon's voice behind her, quiet. "Everything," she said. "I see everything." He stood beside her, close enough that the golden thread between them blazed warmly rather than urgently, content now in a way it had never been able to be before. "Tell me." So she did. Standing in the dark in the frost-edged garden, she described every thread she could see, and he listened to all of it, and she didn't apologize for a single word. At the feast that had started this, the blazing hall, the lonely corner, the bread that had been the first food she'd eaten since dawn, she had made herself as small and invisible as possible, and told herself that corners were the only places left for someone like her. She had been wrong. She was made for the center of everything. She had simply needed someone who could see that before she could see it herself. And somewhere in the castle, in a chair by a warm fire with a cup of something she was actually drinking, Kathleen Richmond smiled and thought about grandchildren. Epilogue. 6 months later, the great hall held another feast. Lorei sat at the high table in deep green silk, Marmon beside her, Kathleen to her right looking more alive than she had looked in a decade. The hall blazed with the same 1,000 candles, the same tables of roasted meat and honeyed bread and expensive wine. She looked toward the servants' corner. A girl sat there, young, 17 at most, eating bread alone, head down, doing the careful invisible work of not being noticed. Lorei excused herself from the high table. She crossed the hall without ceremony and sat down on the bench beside the girl. The girl looked up, startled. The expression of someone who had been trained to understand that important people didn't sit in servants' corners. "What's your name?" Lorei asked. "Maria, my..." The girl stopped. "Maria Turlow. Just Maria is fine," Lorei said. "The bread here is excellent. I should know. I ate it alone in this corner once." Maria stared at her. "Is the work all right?" Lorei asked. "Are you treated well?" "Yes, you're..." A pause. "Yes." "Good. If that ever changes, you come to me directly." She held the girl's gaze until she was sure it had landed. "Do you understand?" Maria nodded. Lorei sat with her for a while longer, talking about nothing important. The bread, the candles, the weight of a long shift. When she returned to the high table, Marmon was watching her with the expression she had learned to recognize as the one he wore when he was feeling something he hadn't yet found words for. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Only that you are exactly who I thought you were." From Kathleen's direction came a quiet, satisfied sound that she didn't bother disguising. Lorei picked up her goblet and looked out over the hall. Every thread visible, every bond glowing. The beautiful, complicated living web of people bound to each other in every way that people were capable of binding. She had survived by hiding what she could see. She had nearly lost herself trying to keep that promise. But she lived, truly lived, by finally letting herself be seen. By sitting at the table instead of against the wall. By speaking what her eyes showed her rather than swallowing it back down. And she would spend every day of the life in front of her, making certain that no one in her pack had to eat alone in a corner and call it enough. The feast roared around her, warm and bright and full of life. She ate her excellent bread. And she was seen.